Every empire that ever collapsed left behind the same archaeological evidence. Not the ruins of its cities, not the records of its debts. The evidence is in its alliances, in the treaties it abandoned, in the partners it left behind. Because no empire has ever fallen from the outside first. They fall from within the architecture of trust that held everything together. And right now, that architecture is making a sound historians recognize. In the spring of 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire did not fall to an invading army. It dissolved. The Germanic chieftain Odoacer, who deposed the last Roman emperor, was not a foreign conqueror. He was a former officer in the Roman military. His soldiers were foederati, Germanic tribes who had been recruited, armed, and integrated into Rome's defense system over generations. They spoke Latin. They served Rome's eagles. And when Rome could no longer pay them, when Rome could no longer keep its promises, they did not wait for the empire to recover. They became the empire's replacement. This is how the end of a world order works, not with an explosion, with a withdrawal of trust. There is a document that sits at the center of the modern world order. Most people have never read it. Most people don't know it exists. It is not a treaty in the conventional sense. It is a network of understandings, of commitments, of arrangements made in rooms where history was decided. After 1945, the United States did something no empire had ever done quite this way. It did not simply occupy the territories it had defeated. It built an alliance system so comprehensive, so deeply embedded in the economic and security architecture of the world, that participating in it was more valuable than opposing it. NATO bound Western Europe. The security umbrella extended to Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia. The dollar became the global reserve currency not simply because of American economic power, but because of what the power guaranteed. Stability, predictability, the promise that the rules would hold. This was not generosity, it was architecture. The United States made itself indispensable, not by force alone, but by becoming the load-bearing wall of the global system. And load-bearing walls, when they shift, bring everything down with them. In 1956, Britain made a decision that historians still argue about. The Suez Crisis. Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain and France, in coordination with Israel, launched a military operation to retake it. They were winning militarily. And then the United States told them to stop. Not asked, told. The Eisenhower administration threatened to sell its sterling reserves, which would have collapsed the British pound. The message was clear. The post-war world had a new organizing power, and it was not London. Britain withdrew, France withdrew, the canal stayed Egyptian. What followed was not simply a military or diplomatic defeat. It was the moment Britain understood, at the deepest institutional level, that the age of independent British imperial action was over, that its security, its currency, its global position, all of it depended on American support. From that moment forward, British foreign policy operated under a framework that has never fully been named but has always been understood. Alignment with Washington was not a choice. It was a survival condition. This is what an alliance means when it functions. It means the smaller partner subordinates its autonomy in exchange for security and economic stability. The larger partner provides those things in exchange for loyalty, basing rights, intelligence sharing, and the political legitimacy that comes from not standing alone. It is a transaction. But it is a transaction that, when it holds, creates something neither side could build alone. When it breaks, something else entirely begins. The word transactional has entered the language of American foreign policy with unusual frequency in recent years. Alliances, it is now said openly, should be transactional. Partners should pay their fair share. Commitments should be conditional on compliance. Loyalty should be purchased, not assumed. This framing is not new in the history of empires. It is, in fact, a very old framing, and it has a consistent historical track record. When Rome began demanding direct payment from its foederati rather than offering land and honor, the relationship transformed. The Germanic tribes were no longer partners in a shared project. They were mercenaries in someone else's system. And mercenaries, throughout history, have always made the same calculation when circumstances change. They calculate whether loyalty is worth more than the alternative. The moment an alliance partner begins making that calculation openly, the moment the question becomes, what is this worth to me, rather than, what do we build together, the architecture has already begun to fail. Not loudly, not visibly, but structurally. Consider what the dollar system actually requires to function. The United States dollar is the world's primary reserve currency. This means that when countries trade with each other, even countries that have no direct relationship with the United States, they often do so in dollars. When central banks hold foreign exchange reserves, they hold dollars. When oil is priced, it is priced in dollars. When emerging market debt is issued, it is often denominated in dollars. This is not simply a product of American economic size. It is a product of American institutional trust. Countries hold dollars because they believe in the stability of the system those dollars represent. They use dollars in their transactions because the network is so deep, so universally adopted, that opting out is more costly than participating. They accept dollar hegemony because, in exchange, they receive access to the world's deepest financial markets, the security of American alliance commitments, and the political stability that comes from operating within a rules-based order. Remove the alliances, remove the trust, remove the predictability. What remains is a currency backed by the world's largest military and the world's largest debt. History has a name for currencies backed only by power. They are called declining reserve currencies. In 1967, the French government loaded gold onto ships and sailed it across the Atlantic. Charles de Gaulle had decided that France was holding too many dollars, that the Bretton Woods system, which allowed the United States to print dollars and exchange them for gold at a fixed rate, was, in his words, an exorbitant privilege that America was abusing. France was not wrong. The United States had been running deficits, spending on the Vietnam War, expanding domestic programs, printing dollars that it exchanged for gold it could not indefinitely supply. De Gaulle's gold repatriation was not simply a financial maneuver, it was a political statement. It said, "We do not fully trust this system. We do not fully trust that the promises behind it will hold." Other countries watched. In 1971, Richard Nixon closed the gold window. Dollars could no longer be exchanged for gold. The Bretton Woods system ended not with a negotiation, but with a unilateral decision made on a Sunday evening. America's allies were not consulted. They were informed. The German finance minister at the time called it a declaration of bankruptcy. The French called it the end of an era. They were not wrong about that either. But here is what the history books rarely capture about what followed. The dollar survived. It did not survive because Bretton Woods held. It survived because in the years after 1971, the United States rebuilt the architecture of dollar dependence on a new foundation. The petrodollar system, the recycling of oil revenues through American financial markets, the expansion of NATO eastward, the integration of global supply chains through American-led institutions, the deepening of financial relationships that made the cost of exiting the dollar system prohibitive. The dollar survived 1971 because America rebuilt its alliances on new terms. The question that history now poses, quietly, analytically, without drama, is what happens when those new terms are also abandoned. Watch the signals that systems send before they break. In the months before Lehman Brothers collapsed in 2008, the credit default swap market was already pricing risk that the official models refused to acknowledge. The signals were there. They were observable. They required only the willingness to read them without the assumption that the system would self-correct. In the months before Britain left the gold standard in 1931, the flight of capital from London was visible to anyone watching the Bank of England's reserves. The signals were there. In the years before the Soviet Union collapsed, the growing divergence between official economic statistics and the reality of Soviet industrial output was documented in academic literature that Western governments largely chose to ignore. Systems send signals. The signal worth watching now is not a single event. It is a pattern. When long-standing allies begin quietly diversifying their reserve holdings away from dollars, not dramatically, but incrementally, that is a signal. When countries that have operated within the American security umbrella for decades begin conducting security discussions with counterparts outside that umbrella, not publicly, but in working groups and back channels, that is a signal. When multilateral institutions that were built to express American-led global governance begin operating with reduced American engagement, not collapsing, but adapting, that is a signal. No single signal breaks a system. But historians looking back at every major system transition in the last 5 centuries have noted the same thing. The signals were always visible before the break. The question was never whether they were there. The question was whether anyone was willing to name what they meant. There is a concept in structural engineering called progressive collapse. It is what happens when a load-bearing element fails and redistributes stress to adjacent elements that were not designed to carry that load. Those elements begin to strain. If the redistribution continues, if the original failure is not addressed, the stress cascades. Elements fail in sequence, and a structure that appeared stable undergoes rapid, total failure. Alliance systems are load-bearing structures. When the United States makes a security commitment to a partner, that commitment is a panel in the structure. Other partners observe it. They calculate their own exposure based on the assumption that similar commitments apply to them. They make decisions about defense spending, about economic integration, about political alignment, based on the load-bearing capacity they believe the structure provides. When commitments become conditional, when partners begin calculating whether the panel they are standing on will hold, the load does not disappear, it redistributes. And redistributed load in a system not designed to carry it looks, from the outside, like instability, like unpredictability, like the early stages of something that engineers and historians both recognize. The British Empire's decline offers a slower version of the same story. Britain did not lose its empire in a day. It lost it over 40 years of managed retreat that never quite managed to stay ahead of the structural failures it was trying to contain. Each withdrawal created a vacuum. Each vacuum required a response that Britain increasingly lacked the capacity to provide. Each commitment it could not keep reduced the credibility of the commitments it was still trying to maintain. By the time Britain reached Suez in 1956, the architecture had already been hollowed out. The crisis revealed what the architecture had become, a facade that required American support to function at all. Empires do not announce their decline. They discover it in the moment they need their system to perform, and find that the system has quietly, incrementally, structurally changed into something that no longer performs in the way they assumed. The institutions built after 1945 were not built by accident. The IMF, the World Bank, NATO, the network of bilateral security agreements, the dollar-based trading system. All of it was architecture. Architecture built to make American leadership the path of least resistance for every major economy in the world. To exit this architecture was not simply a political decision, it was an economic one. The cost of non-participation was designed to be higher than the cost of compliance. This is what made the system stable. Not force, not ideology. Cost. When the cost calculus begins to shift, when participation costs approach the cost of alternatives, systems built on that calculus begin their transformation, not into chaos, into something else, something historically presided over not by the declining power, but by the emerging powers that found the alternatives. Empires do not collapse overnight. The historians are careful about this. They push back against the narrative of sudden collapse because the evidence rarely supports it. What looks sudden in retrospect was almost always a culmination. The final visible break is rarely the cause of the failure. It is the revelation of a failure that had been accumulating for years, sometimes decades, in the load-bearing structures that no one was watching closely enough. Rome's fall in 476 was the culmination of a process that had been underway for at least a century. Britain's post-imperial decline was legible in the economic data of the 1920s. The dollar's exorbitant privilege had critics who understood its structural vulnerabilities long before Nixon closed the gold window. The pattern is consistent. The system signals. Institutions respond, but reactively, not preventively. Responses create new dependencies that themselves become vulnerabilities. And then, at some point that is always obvious in retrospect and almost never obvious in the moment, the accumulation becomes a break, not a loud break. History's most consequential breaks are never loud. They are the moment when the people who built the system realize that the system they are trying to protect is no longer the system that exists. And what comes after, what always comes after, is not determined by those who failed to see it coming. It is determined by those who were already building something else. The question worth sitting with is not whether this transition is happening. The signals are visible. The question, who is building what comes next, and whether those who should be paying attention are,